They thought I'd roll over the moment I got their fancy envelope, that I'd sell out 3 generations of sweat, soil, and stubbornness for a couple zeros and a country club membership. But the only thing more offensive than their offer was the forged signature they used to make it. I've spent my life calibrating systems that orbit Earth, and they really thought I wouldn't notice a fake scribble with no tremor in the T? That signature had the nerve to look confident? Mine hasn't done that since '98. So when I read that letter, claiming I'd voluntarily transferred 15 of my 20 acres to the newly created Langford Lakes HOA for community recreation, I didn't just spill my coffee. I nearly melted through the cup. Leave a comment below, tell me where you're tuning in from. If you live for stories that feel too wild to be fiction, packed with twists, justice, and just enough HOA madness to make your coffee taste better, go ahead and smash that subscribe button, because this is a story of how I turned 20 acres into an impenetrable fortress, and the electric fence was just the beginning. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I checked them during my lunch breaks while preparing for the upcoming court hearing. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when my quiet life imploded. That land is my family's story in acres. My granddad tilled it by hand, my dad brought in the first diesel, and I wired up solar sensors long before Seattle Starbucks started pretending they were sustainable. It's not a mansion, but it's ours. 20 acres, 1 barn, 2 horses, and a workshop full of memories I didn't ask anyone to redevelop. I didn't sign anything, not a sale, not a membership, not a napkin at a barbecue, but there it was, in writing. Some legalese-laced scam telling me I was now part of Langford Lakes and my barn was slated to become the Wellness Welcome Pavilion. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or charge them a daily rate for renting my grass. I called my neighbor Glenn, the only man on this road who knows the fence line better than the mayor knows his donors. "Tom," he said, "you too?" That's when the knot formed. Turns out the whole eastern side of our town was being swallowed up by something called Langford Development Group. If they couldn't buy you, they buried you in paperwork. If that didn't work, well, that's where the creative signatures came in. Glenn told me he'd already spoken to 3 other families who swore they'd never signed anything either, yet their plat maps now had bright green overlays labeled Future Amenities. That morning, I was a retired engineer enjoying sunrise coffee. By lunch, I was a man with a forged document and a legally stolen ranch. So I took that letter, drove straight down to the gleaming new building that used to be Mitchell's Apple Orchard, now labeled Langford Lakes HOA Administrative Center, and walked in like I'd built the place. Inside, all marble floors and fake ferns, a receptionist with a headset too tight gave me a smile that cracked when I dropped the letter on her desk. "I need to speak with whoever forged this," I said, maybe too calmly. A few minutes later, I was face to face with Veronica Langford herself, mid-40s, polished, predatory, and seated behind a desk that probably cost more than my truck. "Mr. Breckman, I assure you everything has been filed according to county procedure," she purred, pushing a folder toward me like she was selling vitamins, not my inheritance. "And we're offering very generous compensation for the remaining 5 acres. That's when I stopped playing polite. "You're offering me hush money for a crime," I said. "And by the way, your forgery artist might want to study a bit harder next time." I have a tremor in my right hand, always have. NASA still hired me. Her smile faltered for the first time, but she recovered quick, with that smug HOA tone I've come to recognize as passive aggression in a pantsuit. "Mr. Breckman, you're welcome to seek legal advice, but fighting this will be costly, time-consuming, and ultimately futile. The development is moving forward, with or without your cooperation." I stood, folded the letter, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. "Then I guess it'll be without." I turned to leave and paused at the door. More thing, I helped design power systems for aircraft that survive re-entry. So if you think your HOA bylaws scare me, you're not just wrong. You're underestimating a very bored, very retired old man. I found out about the meeting the way most people find out about betrayal, by accident. Glenn mentioned it in passing, said all Langford Lakes members were summoned to the new community center at 7 p.m. Funny, no invite showed up in my mailbox. I guess they assumed forged signatures come with forged silence. I cleaned the dust off my old Boeing windbreaker, the one with the stitched logo that always made people talk slower around me, and walked in uninvited. When I slipped through the back doors, I felt like I was stepping into a stage play, and they had cast my property as a supporting character in their spa fantasy. That's the thing about ambition in khakis. It always underestimates old men with good posture. The room buzzed with wine-sipping newcomers and real estate reps pointing at glowing screens. On the largest wall, a digital rendering proudly displayed Langford Lakes Vision 2026. There it was, my barn, except in this version it had been whitewashed, solar-paneled, and rebranded as the Zen Arrival Pavilion. I hadn't even left the building and they were already planning where to hang the eucalyptus. As I stood there staring, I realized they weren't developing land, they were erasing it, replacing sweat with spa, roots with renderings. I stepped forward before I lost my nerve, because if there was ever a time to be loud, it was when your legacy's being photoshopped into a brochure. "I'd like to know how you plan to build a yoga pavilion on land you don't own," I said, voice level but sharp like a tool that had been recently sharpened. Heads turned. The man on stage, a smooth-faced lawyer named Clive something, paused, then looked down at a clipboard. "Mr. Breckman, I believe you voluntarily joined the HOA per the signed agreement on file," he said, smiling like someone who had never worked a real Tuesday in his life. There it was, the refrain. Voluntarily, like I'd walked in one day and said, "Sure, ruin my land, call it a lifestyle, and charge me monthly for the privilege." It was the kind of word they use to flip theft into agreement. I almost laughed. I didn't get far before Veronica stepped up to the mic with a gracious smirk only a guilty person wears well. "We'll have to ask you to leave, Mr. Breckman. This is a members-only event." I looked around the room, caught a few uncomfortable glances. One woman even avoided my eyes entirely, like HOA fraud might be contagious. I nodded once, slow like an old engine turning over with purpose. "Then I guess I'll see you in court," I said. But as I turned to walk out, I caught Veronica's face. Not smug now, but calculating. That look you get from someone who knows they crossed a line and just started planning how to hide the footprints. If they thought that was the end of it, they were about to learn the hard way. Retirement's a dangerous thing in the hands of an engineer with free time. Back home, I called Alexis. My daughter and I hadn't spoken as much as we should have since her mother passed. Grief doesn't come with instructions, and I'd buried myself in the workshop instead of showing up with the kind of words daughters sometimes need. But that night, when I explained everything, the forged documents, the fake meeting, the digital graveyard of my land, she didn't hesitate. "Don't do anything else, Dad. I'm coming home." I hadn't heard that tone in her voice since her first year at law school when she took on her professor in front of the entire class and won. That's when I knew this just became a two-front war. When she walked through the door the next evening, dragging a wheeled suitcase and a laptop bag that looked heavier than her, I saw something that gave me real hope, not just in the fight, but in us. She kissed my cheek, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. "Dad, this isn't sloppy fraud. This is coordinated. These filings were pushed through in 6 weeks. That's record speed, and look at this. County signatures from officials who've never once signed land transfers before." She was uncovering a roadmap of corruption with the precision of a surgeon. As she spread documents across our kitchen table, one thing became clear. They hadn't just targeted me. They'd mapped out a takeover of every legacy lot in a 10-mile radius that didn't come with political connections. This wasn't about a golf course. It was a corporate heist in slow motion. And I'll tell you, once Alexis gets a scent of truth, not even a court full of Ivy League suits can stop her. Stay tuned. This was just the opening statement. There's a certain peace in knowing your land has limits, hedges you can define, defend, and walk at dawn with a mug in hand. But when those lines are crossed by people who speak in contracts instead of conversation, Peace has to evolve. So I went to my workshop and pulled out the old notebooks, the ones from my days wiring fault-tolerant circuits for the upper atmosphere. They weren't pretty, mostly coffee-stained and half in shorthand, but they held something more important than revenge. They held precision. If Langford Lakes wanted to redraw my boundaries with fake signatures, I'd redraw them in wire, volts, and warnings they couldn't ignore. Not with lawyers, with science. 3 days later, my ranch was surrounded by something the locals had never seen. High-gauge wire, properly mounted insulators, solar-charged battery arrays, motion streamers, surveillance cams, and, my favorite, a variable voltage system that would stay legal until provoked. It looked like a security fence, but it behaved like a conversation. Polite if you respected it, unforgiving if you didn't. I posted signs every 20 feet, bright yellow, bold text. Private property, electrified boundary, enter at your own legal and physical risk. The kind of message that doesn't whisper, it announces. A few of the new HOA types drove by slow, snapping pictures, like I'd built a UFO landing strip. Maybe I had a UFO of accountability. Reactions were instant. My neighbor Glenn just tipped his cap and said, "Looks like the mothership landed." The local mom blogger called it a disgrace to the community aesthetic. A real estate agent left a note offering to beautify the frontage. But one teenage kid from down the road fist-bumped me in the grocery store parking lot and said, "You're the dude with the shock fence, right? That's metal." Yeah, kid, it is. The fence wasn't about intimidation. It was about memory. Every coil of copper reminded me I hadn't built this life to be annexed by developers in khaki and key cards. It was my line in the soil, and they noticed, especially Veronica. She showed up the following Friday in a black SUV that gleamed like overconfidence. 2 HOA reps flanked her like backup singers. "Mr. Breckman," she began, voice syrupy with self-importance, "this fence violates multiple aesthetic and community safety guidelines. I'm going to have to ask you to take it down immediately." I didn't flinch. Not part of your HOA, remember? And even if I were, agricultural zoning trumps aesthetic whining. Section 12143B, look it up. She stepped forward but stopped short of the fence, reading the signs again like they were in a foreign language. That's when Officer Gomez pulled up, small town, good man, neutral stance. After inspecting the voltage, the signage, and the permits I'd already filed, he tipped his hat and said, "It's legal." A little unorthodox, but legal. Veronica's smile flickered, then vanished. For the first time, I saw uncertainty creep into her expression, and that told me I'd struck something more valuable than land. Nerve. As the HOA carpool sputtered away, a man stepped out from a dusty Ford on the shoulder. Late 50s, long braid, walking stick like it had a story. "Name's Cody Tallfeather," he said. "Heard you put up something worth seeing." We shook hands. He told me he was with the Tribal Heritage Council and had worked on a preservation case up north. That southeastern stretch of your land, by the creek, might be more than just pasture. There's history in those stones. I raised an eyebrow. Like artifacts? Cody nodded. Grinding pits. Possibly burial sites. Could trigger federal protection if it checks out. Suddenly, my voltage fence wasn't just a line. It might be a wall standing between greed and memory. And just like that, the battle wasn't only personal, it was cultural. I stood there, thinking about what Cody had said and what Veronica had tried to do, and realized they'd built castles out of signatures. I'd wired a citadel from every volt I ever engineered. And we were just getting started. What came next? Let's just say the ground was about to shift. Literally. The motion sensor went off at 2:13 a.m. sharp. Just one soft chime on my workbench monitor, but enough to wake me like a fire alarm in a thunderstorm. I pulled up the camera feed expecting raccoons, or maybe that possum I'd seen lurking near the compost pile, but nope. This time, it wasn't nature testing my perimeter. It was politics in polished shoes. 2 figures, both male, creeping along my southeast fence line with measuring tools and what looked like a blueprint. One of them was crouched, pointing to the corner post near the creek. The other stood still, whispering into a headset like he was trying to order a tactical strike without waking the neighbors. Then the porch light hit his face. Cameron Price, the mayor's assistant. Bingo. Now, I don't consider myself a paranoid man, but I've seen enough backdoor deals wrapped in public smiles to know when something reeks. Cameron had no business being on my land, and even less business carrying a clipboard with Langford Development printed in bold across the top. I hit record and leaned in. They weren't measuring fences. They were searching for loopholes. That told me one thing. My fence was working. Not just physically, but psychologically. It had become a boundary they couldn't legally cross, but desperately wanted to. And you know what's more dangerous than a greedy developer? A greedy developer running out of time. I called Alexis before sunrise. "We've got footage," I said. "Guess who showed up in my creek bed at 2 a.m. with blueprints and a flashlight?" She didn't even guess. She just said, "On my way." By mid-morning, she was at the kitchen table, reviewing the video frame by frame. "This isn't just civil encroachment," she muttered. "This smells like coordinated trespassing under color of office." She pulled out her phone and made 3 calls in 10 minutes. County records, the District Preservation Office, and someone named Janice Wilkes. I didn't know who Janice was yet, but when Alexis handed me a folder labeled Langford Development, Alternate Filings, I knew this story was about to split wide open. Janice showed up that afternoon, mid-40s, sharp eyes, wore boots instead of heels. "I don't cover gossip," she said. "I cover patterns. And you, Mr. Breckman, are sitting on one hell of a pattern." She pulled out a laptop, flipped it open, and showed us 2 reports from neighboring counties. Almost identical HOA names, nearly identical maps, same tactics. Landowners overwhelmed with paperwork, a golf course on the brochure, a casino in the blueprints. "Langford Development," she said, "is a front. Behind it, Blue Sky Properties out of Las Vegas, and behind them, a quiet agreement to build a multi-phase resort and gambling complex spanning 3 counties, with your ridge as the crown jewel." I looked out my window toward the pasture and let that settle. They weren't trying to build a golf course. They were building a lie with a tea time. I laughed once, bitter and low. "So that's why they forged my name, not for pickleball courts, but for poker tables." Janice nodded. "And your barn? It's not a wellness pavilion, it's the planned concierge center for a high-end casino spa." I stood up. "They call it progress, I call it eviction dressed in linen suits." Janice looked up. "That's your quote, I'm using it." Alexis was already halfway through an injunction form when Cody pulled into the driveway. Cody Tallfeather walked in like a man with gravity in his pockets. "We finished the initial scan," he said, holding up a rolled map and a zip drive. "Your southeast acres hold significant tribal artifacts. Grinding pits, stone tools, possibly burial markers. We've got photographic evidence, GPS coordinates, and signed statements from the tribal council." He handed it all to Alexis, who looked like someone had just handed her the legal version of a nuclear launch code. "That means federal protection?" I asked. "Yes," Cody said, "and an automatic 90-day development freeze while a full cultural survey is conducted. That land, it's not just yours anymore. It belongs to history." Alexis filed the injunction that day. While she filled in forms, I printed stills from the security video and dropped off a copy at Officer Gomez's desk. "This might be above your pay grade," I said, "but it's not above the law." He gave me a tight nod. "I'll file it, and I'll make sure it's noted who was caught on camera." That night, Janice published a teaser, the golf course that wasn't. No names yet. Just a timeline, a pattern, and a warning. The story hit like a lit match in dry grass. Phone calls came in. Neighbors who'd waved coldly now waved me down. Someone left a pie on my porch with a note that said, "Sorry for calling your fence excessive. Turns out it was exactly what we needed." By the next morning, Veronica was doing damage control. She hosted a community unity brunch at the clubhouse. I didn't go, but I heard the quiche was undercooked and the crowd wasn't buying it. Cameron Price stopped showing up at City Hall. Mayor Simmons issued a statement about alleged misunderstandings and respecting all stakeholders. But the tone had shifted. For the first time, they weren't dictating. They were spinning, And if there's one thing worse than a crook with confidence, it's a crook who's been caught on camera holding a map to their own scam. Meanwhile, Janice dug deeper. She found emails, internal communications between Langford execs discussing accelerated acquisitions and mitigating indigenous risk factors. Her words, not mine. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Tom, this isn't just shady, it's textbook corporate colonization." Cody nodded. "Same tactics we've been fighting for decades. They wrap it in progress and call it compromise, but it's just theft in a necktie." I looked at Alexis. "How soon before this hits court?" She cracked her knuckles. "Soon enough to scare them, not soon enough to stop them. Yet." So we doubled down. Janice expanded the article. Alexis filed a preservation priority flag with the federal office. Cody scheduled the formal tribal hearing. And me? I rewired the perimeter fence to include noise-dampened infrared triggers and added 6 more cameras. Because while they were scrambling PR statements, I was preparing for the next move. These folks weren't just crooks. And desperation's loudest just before it snaps. So we stayed ready. Because the war wasn't over. In fact, it was about to go public. 2 days after Janice's article dropped and the preservation injunction was filed, I got a letter taped to my gate. No postage, no envelope, just bold red letters. Notice of immediate termination, utility infrastructure safety violation. It wasn't from the county, it wasn't even from the HOA. It was from the city safety department, a group I'd never heard from in my life. Apparently, my unauthorized electrical perimeter posed a hazard to community continuity, and my water lines showed irregular pressure differentials. In other words, they cut my power and water because my fence was too smart for their scam. That's not safety. That's sabotage dressed in municipal letterhead. The irony? I'd spent half my career designing energy systems for places where sunlight was the only reliable resource, and water came in bags, not pipes. You learn to engineer self-sufficiency when your clients orbit Earth. So while they thought cutting me off would drive me out, I was already 4 steps ahead. I walked into my barn, flipped open my schematic binder, and started connecting the parts I'd quietly been stockpiling for a year. Solar panels, lithium battery banks, a rainwater reclamation system with a NASA-grade filter I'd prototyped in 8.8. "If power means control," I said, tightening the last bolt, "then I brought my own damn sun." It took me 48 hours to rewire the entire homestead. Alexis helped route the system through a regulatory bypass we knew was legal. Miguel showed up with extra panels from his cousin's farm. Glenn loaned me his trailer to haul the last 2 tanks. By Sunday night, the barn lights were glowing, the well was running, and the fridge was humming like nothing ever happened. The city turned off my switch, so I built a whole new circuit, and when the neighbors heard about it, something shifted. Some drove by slower, some stopped and asked questions. One woman came by just to say she'd signed that HOA agreement, because she thought it meant community gardens, not corporate blackmail. "Didn't know you were fighting for all of us," she said, "but I'm glad you are." Of course, not everyone was thrilled. A few of the HOA diehards didn't like that I'd turned their little power play into a science fair project. "Excessive," one called it. "Hostile," said another. The funniest one was from a man who asked if I was trying to go off-grid and incite rebellion. I told him, I'm not off-grid. I just stopped letting the grid tell me who owns my land. By Tuesday, I got hit with the next punch. A civil lawsuit from the HOA claiming I'd endangered the shared value of community property by resisting common development. Then came the sledgehammer. The city filed for eminent domain, said my property fell under a public safety corridor and needed to be cleared for environmental realignment. Alexis spent the entire day in a frenzy of legal motion. "They're trying to wear us out with filings," she said, skimming pages. "It's lawfare by exhaustion." But the more they filed, the more transparent they got. Every new motion mentioned the necessity of progress, the harm of outdated infrastructure, or my favorite, the dangers of anti-growth extremism. That one made me laugh out loud. 35 years of building systems to make progress possible, and now I was labeled a relic for not wanting to turn a creek into a craps table. I wasn't anti-growth, I was anti-grift, and apparently that made me dangerous. By Thursday, the local news vans started circling. They weren't here for the land anymore, they were here for the story. The man who got cut off and stayed lit. The man who lost his utilities and built his own lifeline. One reporter asked, "Mr. Breckman, how does it feel to be the face of anti-OA resistance?" I shrugged. Feels like Tuesday, except now my water tastes better, my lights are cleaner, and I know exactly who's paying for it. Me. That clip went viral in 4 counties. Janice followed up with a headline, "When they cut his power, he went solar. When they blocked his water, he made rain." But here's where the real story turned. That same day, I found a letter on my porch from a retired city planner, anonymous, unsigned, typed in courier. It detailed a Phase 2 zoning map that had already been drafted and quietly approved by the mayor's office. My ranch? Centerpiece of a future development now labeled Skyrise North, Mixed Entertainment District. It wasn't just about casino space. They were planning hotels, shuttle stops, even a helipad. The whole preservation talk. A stalling tactic until construction permits locked in. Alexis scanned the letter, then looked at me with the kind of calm that only comes before a storm. They're racing. They want the land before the historical board certifies it. We need to stall them. Hard. So we did. Alexis filed for an emergency evidentiary hearing. Cody prepared a tribal presentation for the state council. I installed motion-activated floodlights and a secondary power loop. Miguel brought over a fireproof document safe. We weren't just surviving now. We were entrenching. And more people joined us. A woman from the community college offered to do an environmental impact study for free. A retired Marine offered to guard the property perimeter during hearings. "You protected the land," he said. "Time somebody protected you." That night, for the first time since this fight began, I realized I wasn't alone, and neither were they. HOA filed a complaint the next morning, claiming my solar panels were unregistered light pollution. That was their next move, claiming sunlight wasn't mine to harness. I walked outside, looked up at the sky, and just grinned. "Try taking that to court," I muttered. As absurd as it was, the intent was clear. If they couldn't control me, they'd criminalize me. If they couldn't evict me, they'd out-regulate me. But here's what they didn't understand. Every time they swung the system like a weapon, I wired another workaround. Every document they filed made me smarter. Every trick they played taught me a countermeasure. They were playing Monopoly. I was writing the operating manual for the board. So when the next city truck rolled by, when the next neighbor peeked over the fence, when the next press release claimed I was destabilizing community cohesion, I didn't blink. Because when the system fails you, you don't cave, you rewire. I hadn't just restored my water and power, I'd restored my autonomy. And what they were starting to learn, slowly, painfully, was this. I didn't need their wires, their water, or their permission. I had my own light, I had my own rain, and I had a daughter with sharper filings than a sawmill lawyer. What I didn't have was fear. That had been cut off the same day they'd tried to pull the plug, and believe me, they hadn't seen anything yet. The funny thing about backup plans is that you don't always know which one is going to save you. You just build them all and hope one hits like lightning. Weeks before the fence went up, before Alexis returned, before cameras ever rolled, I had a hunch. Not the kind of hunch you brag about, but the kind that simmers quiet in the gut of a man who's been lied to by polished people in expensive chairs. So I built something small, legal adjacent, ethically gray. I called it a non-invasive signal listener, a piece of hardware I'd designed at NASA to detect radiation frequencies through ceramic walls. Except now it was listening for one thing only: my name spoken near anything suspicious inside the HOA office. I'd tucked 2 of them in the AHVAC vent at the Langford Community Center when I was invited to that first fake welcome tour. They were legal by letter, passive, non-recording, only activating if key phrases like Breckman, property, or signature were spoken. When those terms hit, they'd trigger a paired device in my barn, recording the next 3 minutes. I didn't tell Alexis, not because I didn't trust her, but because she was still playing by courtroom rules. And me? I was playing by the kind of rules forged in the gap between common sense and common law. Last week, the triggers started lighting up like a Vegas strip on payday. 5 separate activations. One of them mentioned the mayor by name. Another included the phrase, "move forward with demo while he sleeps." I stitched them together, loaded them to a drive, and called Jennifer. "Bring your crew," I said. "It's time we let the whole county watch what due process looks like when crooks think no one's filming." She showed up with 2 cameras, 3 interns, and a battery pack the size of a toolbox. Alexis tried to play it cool, but I could see her pulse in her temple. "Dad, if this works, it'll be huge. If it doesn't..." I cut her off. "If it doesn't, we'll wire up something bigger." We didn't have to wait long. At exactly 2:07 p.m., 3 city trucks rolled up my road, tailed by 2 black SUVs and 1 contractor van loaded with bulldozer treads. No knock, no phone call, no warrant in hand. Just Veronica Langford stepping out in wedge heels and a clipboard, pointing like Caesar surveying Gaul. "Under Emergency Development Ordinance, this property is hereby scheduled for structural removal within the hour," she declared, loud enough for the camera. Jennifer was already live. Comments poured in like water through a broken levee. "This is wild. Is that the mayor's assistant in the back? Why does she look nervous?" That last one hit the nail because the second my camera swung toward the SUVs, the back door cracked open and out stepped Mayor Simmons. I didn't even need to say anything. Jennifer's mic caught his voice clear as spring water. "Just get the structure cleared before the injunction holds. This land can't stall us again." Then he spotted the live stream camera and stiffened like he'd been shot with a taser. "Is that..." Jennifer smiled. "Yes, Mr. Mayor. We're live. Thousands watching. Please do continue." Veronica barked something to a contractor who then hesitated, looked toward the fence and muttered, "We don't have legal grounds here." That's when Alexis stepped forward and handed Veronica a thick folder. "Emergency restraining order, issued 90 minutes ago. You've just violated 3 civil statutes on live broadcast. Congratulations." The contractor backed away like he'd just licked a live wire. Mayor Simmons paled. Veronica turned to run, actually run, only to be intercepted by Officer Gomez, who'd been watching quietly from his squad car until the moment demanded presence. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for attempted demolition without court approval and potential involvement in document forgery under investigation." 2 more patrol cars pulled up, then one from the sheriff's office, then another from the state. It was like someone had kicked over a rotten log and out came the whole forest of oversight. And the cameras? Still rolling, still live. Within the hour, Veronica was in cuffs, Simmons was flanked by 2 deputies, and the contractor had already called his lawyer. Gomez turned to me as they were led away and said, "You don't build fences, Tom. You build flashpoints." He wasn't wrong. But this wasn't just my fire. This was every landowner who'd been pushed, tricked, or priced into silence. This was Alexis fighting for due process, Cody standing up for buried history, and Jennifer giving the story a spine. All I did was keep the lights on long enough for justice to show up with a badge. The hearing was set 3 days later. Alexis, sharp as a tack, argued our case like she was auditioning for the Supreme Court. She laid out the timeline, the forged documents, the utility sabotage, the eminent domain lie, the mayor's backroom deal with Blue Sky Resorts. She even played the audio clip of Simmons whispering, "We can't let him stall again. Just flatten the barn." The judge didn't say a word for 10 seconds. Then he leaned forward and said, "This case will be transferred for criminal investigation. But as of today, Mr. Breckman's land is affirmed, protected, and beyond your reach." He slammed the gavel like a thunderclap. I swear, I felt it in my bones. That night, Alexis didn't go back to the city. She stayed. Said she was opening a rural law practice. "There's 100 more people like you out here, Dad. They just don't know what they're up against." Cody and I started designing an outdoor education center on the southeast corner, near the grinding stones. Local schools visited, we set up displays. A few of the kids asked if the fence still worked. It's not just a fence, I told them. It's a heartbeat, wired to the soul of everything worth protecting. 6 months later, the fence still hums. Not out of fear, but as a reminder that when someone tells you progress means giving up what's yours, you don't nod. You ask what they're really selling and who paid for the billboard. They tried to turn my land into a playground for strangers. They left with their names on court documents and arrest records. And me? I kept what mattered. So, if you're watching this story play out on a phone, a tablet, a screen too small for the size of the fight, remember this: sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it hums at the edge of your land, runs on sunlight, drinks the rain, and waits for the moment the world finally looks up and sees the truth. Live. And that's the thing, isn't it? They thought I'd be the one pushed out, paved over, quietly erased. Instead, I built a life louder than their lies, lit by solar, fueled by legacy, protected not just by wire, but by truth. I didn't win with rage. I won with roots, with reason, with a daughter who believed in the law and a fence that hummed a warning they couldn't ignore. They showed up with forged papers and fake smiles. I answered with schematics and grit. And when the system failed, I didn't fall. I rewired. Because this land wasn't just dirt. It was memory. It was promise. It was home. And home? That's always worth defending. So if this story meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated, steamrolled, or told to sit down and smile while someone else signs your rights away, then hit that like button, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from and what you would have done in my boots. And don't forget to subscribe, because we've got more stories coming, more twists, more justice, more underdogs who stood their ground. Because next time, it's a retired librarian who weaponized zoning law to stop a billionaire's drone range. You won't want to miss it. And remember, truth isn't always loud, but when it's wired right, it never goes dark.